So I'm Jim Moore, and I'm happy to have you here. And I must say, I've been in all the sessions but one, and they've been amazing so far. And so one of the things I look forward to do is kind of engaging with you around not only our stuff, but everything that's been so far. I'd like to introduce David Kirkpatrick. David. And David is billed as the moderator, but he's a longtime friend and a colleague and a very serious student of kind of high-tech strategy and high-tech ethics, and these days is focused very much on climate change, and is a great guy. And so he and I are essentially co-presenters here in this thing today, right?
If you say so. I'm doing whatever you need me to do here.
Okay,
and I'm honored to be included
okay,
with,
all right.
with the guru Moore.
All right. Well, I'm honored to be any whatever. Okay, now we're just babbling. All right, so back to the audience. So the other thing we wanted to do, I spoke with Pia yesterday after her interactive session, and I said, can you suggest anything to us so that we can kind of break the fourth wall of this session? And one of the things she said is that she had a great time with Hal Gregerson building up to it, and that helped, that they liked each other. I said, well, David and I have that. That's good. But the other thing she suggested was that we start by us asking you to write into the chat and just say why you're here, because for every single one of you, for you to conclude that you want to spend up to an hour with us today is really quite extraordinary. And there's some things that bring you here. So it would be helpful to us to know, and I think each other to know, what brings you here, or what would you like to get out of this? What are you working on? What are your aspirations? Just a little bit about yourselves. So what I'm actually going to do is not say more, except to kind of encourage you to get in the chat and write us some stuff. Also, I want to point out that you need to adjust from sort of sending just a host and panelists. Down at the bottom on your screen, you can put everyone in the chat, and then we see like that. All right, okay. So let me start quickly with this response to John Yarger's question here: crash course on ecosystems. We live in a world where we need to accomplish a lot of things. And there are a lot of problems to solve. There are a lot of people who aren't connected and could be and should be. There are a lot of resources that aren't connected into systems. And the notion of ecosystems, from my standpoint, is a creative one, and in a sense a managerial one, but a creative one, which has to do with giving yourself the authority and the power as a creative person to think about what things could be brought together that would improve life for us. So it's that general point of view. I think the earlier session on collaborative advantage was wonderful in that sense, the notion that when we collaborate, we can accomplish things that we couldn't otherwise do. I think of Howard Stevenson's definition of entrepreneurship. Howard was the entrepreneurship person at Harvard Business School for years, and it was doing things that are beyond your own reach, doing things that require other people. And ecosystems are certainly that way. And by the way, we all have personal ecosystems, and we all have ways to, we think about our purposes, we can perhaps sharpen them more, we can perhaps think more creatively about them, we can align with other people. But I think it starts with each of us personally, and then builds out. And I would have to say that the biggest change in my thinking over the last 30 years of being in this is, I used to think about ecosystems largely in terms of very large things, sort of the Intel ecosystem or ARM or, I don't know, the open source ecosystem, thinking about these large collaborations of institutions. Obviously, that's still relevant or even more relevant. But these days, what I'm really focused on is people and people's creativity and co-creation. Because when you look at these vast platforms, Facebook or Google or Amazon, they actually don't generate the value. The value is generated by human beings in all sorts of ways that they're participating in these systems. And then the platforms help orchestrate it and make things possible. But they're really just the tip of the iceberg. So one of the things I find fascinating is thinking about, how do you start ecosystems? How do you grow them? How do you build them from that standpoint? Oh, yeah, Pia just says, be sure to select everyone as the recipient. Yes, I think they hopefully got that. Does James Moore have a web page? Yeah, yes, but not a very good one. But in LinkedIn, you can find me. So what I want to do now is have Monica put up the Competition in the Age of Ecosystems banner, because I want to suggest something as a kind of an overall framework for what we're doing here. Over the last 2 years, I've spent time with collaborators in China and here in the Boston area, as well as other parts of the world, trying to understand the you want to call it an ecosystem, trying to understand the collection of people who are practicing and thinking about ecosystems. And it's obviously become a truly kind of global community, and one that's quite interesting and quite diverse. And today's session and yesterday's was an attempt to get some pieces of that so that people could kind of experience the diversity in that. And I would have to say it was, for me, great, but it was only a start. But if I think about what people are doing, I think that there were some people who were dealing with the sort of practical integration of things. And I would start with the ecosystems at work panelists. And then Monica, if you can move to the next one. The panel that I found sort of left me feeling the highest or the most ebullient was Pia and House, because they did break the fourth wall. And I felt like what they were focused on was the human side of ecosystems. It was this human dimension, the human ecosystem, that is kind of undergirds everything else. And so I start to think about the research people are doing in ecosystems as categorized by, very, very simply, broadly, people working in the human dimension, people working in coevolution and processes and systems and technologies, and then socio-technical systems built around that, and then people working in kind of power and more traditional institutional power in business, including finance and kind of competitive theory and so forth. Ron Adner would be somebody in that camp. And I think all three are necessary to have a whole view of what's happening in ecosystems. And so if I can show the next one here. This panel was kind of extraordinary. Everybody there is extraordinary. I know them pretty well, some of them. And John Hagel talked interestingly about, I think he's got now 16 or 18 different types of business ecosystems that he's kind of cracked out. And what I think that does for me is say that business ecosystems are in part, or maybe in large part, an exercise in organization design and in the design of collaborative relationships to get things done. And that, like any organization, they can be designed around different principles and different values, different techniques, different technologies. And so rather than kind of one business ecosystem or one canonical way of doing it, I think we're starting to understand lots of different kinds of ecosystems. We kind of, from the beginning, there have been innovation ecosystems and startup ecosystems and so forth, differing by purpose. But I think people are now understanding better and better how to sort of transform and rework and innovate within the architecture of the ecosystem and within its communities. And Kevin then he's at GE Appliances. For those of you who know him or were at that session, he's been doing a remarkable job in taking GE Appliances, which was in a very traditional ecosystem, GE's corporate ecosystem, and then the home appliance business in the United States, and kind of refactoring it into a much more profoundly ecological set of relationships, lateral, horizontal, highly dynamic relationships. And that, I think, is what we are starting to get into, as people are starting to learn how to sort of engineer, design, do things at least more intentionally in what they're doing with ecosystems. So if I can take the next one. Ron's awesome. Ron's a kind of a traditionalist, and that Ron says, what I really am interested in is the modern day equivalent of five forces. I'm interested in sort of institutions and institutional power and how that plays out. And I actually think that is a sort of an underrepresented point of view in the ecosystem community. And I want to say that in my own practice in organizations, I've often been in a situation where people focused on the human side and the coevolutionary side and got blindsided ultimately by the power institutional politics side. And great example is one way back in the day when Sun Microsystems was attempting to build an ecosystem around open source software and alternative microprocessors and so forth, and had an alliance with AT&T. And then just as sort of things were starting to come together for that ecosystem, it turned out that AT&T had been building some executives at AT&T had been building secret relationships with executives at Intel and managed to sort of flip the power of the ecosystem and in many ways thwart its growth, at least temporarily. So those three aspects are really important. Now going back to the people side, that's the next one. I thought the power of serendipity was just a remarkably interesting one, and essentially being about how do you consciously design your own life so that you can become more receptive and more open to things around you and pick from what is serendipitously available to you and transform your life, transform your world, transform your ecosystem. And I think that's kind of an extremely powerful idea and fits later with this collaborative advantage piece as well in a way that I want to suggest. So next one. So this was a sort of pièce de résistance by Xavier and Thierry. And for those of us who were there, they presented a very complex, and I want to say, having studied these things for a long time, very sophisticated and very sort of intuitively correct model of the overall coevolutionary process. And while it was, beyond what you could sort of unpack in their hour, I thought it was fantastic that they put it out there. And I think that those of you in the audience who are researchers, I urge you to go back to their work and sort of think about the implications of it, because what they're doing is building a sort of a general theory of economic coevolution built around businesses that take innovations in sort of communities and grow them into something bigger. And then let's go to the next one. This panel stunned me. This is really about Black business ecosystems. And what I didn't know, and I said, this is sort of betraying my own naivete, I guess, or my own white naivete, is I had no idea that there was this much going on in Black business ecosystems in practice, but very, very much in study and in consulting and so forth. And so I want to urge you to go back and read these people's papers and go back and later on listen to the tape of this, because I think what you'll find is two things. One is it's a sort of a sub-community building extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of ecosystems and dealing with the community that has been historically oppressed and actually still is oppressed. And so kind of coming from a left foot back, but I don't know, extraordinary input, extraordinary care, really terrific thing. And the other thing that I found fascinating, back to the organization design piece, is that they're designing ecosystems around cooperation, around the value of cooperation. They talked about Ubuntu, the Southern African kind of philosophy of, actually, David, remind me of the Ubuntu sort of derivation.
My understanding of it is that it's translated to be, I am because you are. It's a very, talk about collaboration. It's a way of articulating the intertwinedness of existence. And from a personal point of view, recognizing the value of all others.
Yeah, so growing an ecosystem that way, and several things touched me about this. One, I resonate with the values of that. I certainly, I think fundamentally the best ecosystems are starting from still these kind of opennesses to the potential of other people that come together around a set of higher values and make something happen. And all the really large ecosystems that I've been involved with, more like the Intels and the Facebooks and so forth, they actually start with a few people in a small way, passionate around something that they're pulling together. And so in this case, pulling it together around cooperative advantage, I think is very deep. And I've been working for the last couple of years studying the higher group, obviously a sponsor of this program, an extraordinary Chinese company that over the course of decades has kind of been self-reflective and transparent about all of its sort of evolution and its ecosystem, and has been itself building its ecosystems around traditional Chinese values that are represented in the work of Lao Tzu and the I Ching and so forth. So one of the things we don't talk about much in business is where do our philosophical and spiritual and shared purpose kind of values and concepts and understandings come from. But it has been my experience that I don't know if you want to call it a spiritual competitive advantage, but it's a profound advantage, obviously, for these people, and it certainly is for hire as well, as sort of built into their Rendenhai concept. So next one then. And then finally, this was awesome. So Martin Reeves and I think it's Kahan, I thought did a great job of kind of pulling all the stuff back together and saying, okay, how does this work? And what can we do with this set of tools and ideas? And I thought Kayan's questions were sort of right on about if I'm in the audience and I'm trying to figure out where to go with this, how do I think about that? Where do I start? And then I thought Martin's answers were terrific. And then what was kind of great is as the thing went on, Martin began to talk more and more about, I think he was prompted by the chat, more and more about how to use ecosystems and ecosystem knowledge and techniques to build out and address these larger planetary problems, these existential crises. And he's actually quite interested in that. And that was, from my standpoint, just lovely. So that's the way I kind of experienced the day. And now we're here with David and I. And what we hope to do is talk a bit about, okay, essentially taking off from where Martin ended up, which is, okay, if let's say we sort of know a lot, maybe we don't know enough, but we're starting to know a lot about how to do large scale system development in these ways. How do we start to make that happen around our most profound problems? And obviously one of them is racism, the sort of lack of development of human potential around the world. We have 8 or 9 billion people on the planet. We keep fantasizing that 100 million techies will sort of solve all problems for 8 billion. They won't. We really are going to have 8 billion people as collaborators and developing their potential together. How do we do that? And then how do we keep the climate so that we can survive? So that's my opener. And my idea at this point was to turn to David and ask David to talk a bit about his experience. And I must say, I wish that those of you out on the chat could pop in, but we will hopefully have follow-on discussions and bring all of you in.
But you want me to just say something?
Yeah.
Should I introduce myself, since these people don't really
Yes,
know
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry, please.
Or you could do it if you want. I mean, Jim and I have known each other for 30 years. I'm a business journalist, spent most of my career at Fortune. And then a decade or so ago, I started Techonomy Media after leaving Fortune and writing a book about Facebook called The Facebook Effect. And I just happened to found myself sitting in a place where I had Techonomy backdrops, so I arranged them. I'm not usually this good at branding, which Stuart was making fun of me for. But I'm a business journalist who's cared about, I think, what I guess you'd call progressive values or humane values my entire career, and tried to write about business from that vantage point. And even at Fortune, that was quite readily accepted. I have to be very grateful for that. And I covered tech, so technology was my beat, and tech competition was my main area of journalism. And then in Techonomy, what I've really been doing after starting the Brainstorm conference at Fortune, which was really more about technology as a tool for positive change. Techonomy was a business that I started to really focus on how technology can be a tool for progress writ large. But I wanted to just start by saying one observation, if I could, Jim. It's ironic. We were talking about Ubuntu, the definition of which I got slightly wrong, because it is "I am because we are," as somebody correctly corrected.
Yeah. And Graham, thank you.
but I was thinking how disjunctive it would be for most humans, certainly most Americans, like 99% of Americans, if they were to hear a group of people who are concerned with business and business competition and strategy saying that Ubuntu and that conceptual framework has any relevance at all to the behavior of modern corporations, because that is not the way corporations are perceived. In fact, people would laugh at that. Generally, most people see companies, large companies, as utterly unconcerned with such matters and seeking in general to escape, any true responsibility for their impact on human society. Now, that's certainly, as those of us who are directly involved in business know, not a universally accurate appraisal, but it's generally accurate, I would say. And it's just worth noting that it's so easy to say, but to apply it to business is ungodly hard. And it's great that you all are partisans of a more ecosystem mindset. And I've known Jim, talked about this with him for many decades. But we have to be real. Most companies don't understand. Most CEOs, most leadership teams, the concept of Ubuntu would be a laughable one to try to apply in their day-to-day behavior. I'm sorry to say that, but I think that's irrefutable. But would you disagree with that, Jim?
No, unfortunately, no. I think we boy, how strongly to say this. We live in a management culture that is oriented toward people controlling other people, whether it's people using using Facebook to control consumer behavior and therefore control the lives of consumers, or whether it's people using all sorts of advanced sort of human resources techniques to control their quote human resources, their people. I think management control hierarchy. Management is a hierarchy of control, and that's the system we've got. And honestly, it goes. This is where you may need to moderate me, but honestly, it's very interesting. If you look back, the Industrial Revolution was built also on slavery. On sort of the more the Industrial Revolution made a market for cotton, the more it allowed slave-based cotton production to expand across southern United States. And we have built into our economic system, control of nature, control of people. And I think that's personal too. I think that people are sort of fighting over control a lot of the time in corporations, and so I think when I find myself in situations where that's not happening, it's really extraordinary. So part of why I'm celebrating the folks earlier today. But I also want to say a couple of things. One is, I think in high tech, the balance has shifted somewhat, because the straight out economic value of a high-tech person, a talented high-tech person, can be enormous. And so that gives the person who has that talent enormous amounts of power. And so I do think that in the high-tech world, the more it's a knowledge economy, and the more sort of people and the human parts of people, ironically, are valuable. I mean, in an age where people feel like companies are becoming algorithms, no, what the big companies spend their time on is recruiting people to make algorithms. And so, I think, that's changing. Obviously, as people get wealthier, they have more options. And so they want sort of different things in jobs. But no, I think we have a long way to go. And then hire blew my mind. I mean, when I first was exposed to hire a couple of years ago, I couldn't even believe it was real. I was in Costa Rica, and they got a hold of me and asked if I would kind of have a dialogue with them. And I finally called my friend Ron Ka, who's a professor at Tsinghua of organizations and a longtime friend and colleague. And I said, you have to figure out, are these guys for real? like, they're building a whole company on respecting human potential and, creative human freedom. And supposedly they're the largest manufacturer of appliances in the world. How is this possible? Is this true? Like, is this a Potemkin village? And he said, no, I think it's true. But he said, but he said he went over, he's on a team over. And they did it, kind of long story short, but they looked into it very deeply, and my skepticism converted into kind of, I don't know, incredible deep puzzlement, right? And so I've had to spend the last couple of years trying to figure out how in the world do I account for, what they're doing. And anyway.
There's an irony. That was a good, I'm really glad that you said all that. There's an irony in that right now, as humanity, we are forced to take control in a way that historically we have relinquished and refused to acknowledge, because the planet is so spinning out of control and our climate is so disastrously threatening that we have to no longer really think of it entirely as nature, but think of it as a managed system. And if we don't, we're totally screwed. So it's an irony, given what you were just saying about how managerial culture is all devoted to exercising control. And we are here talking about how, to some extent, success in business or anything is about letting go and accepting the virtue and agency of the people and systems around you, as comprised of people. But at the same time, we have to somehow live in that reality while taking more macro control as governments and business and humanity. And that, ever since I read Stuart Brand's Whole Earth Discipline, I've understood that. In fact, it's one of the reasons I started Techonomy, was that book, actually, which is ironic. But anyway, I'm not so, Jim, you want me to talk a little bit about why we talked about some stuff that have come up in my career that you seem to think were relevant to what you want to talk about today. Shall I quickly go through some of that?
Yeah, I wish you would. I would. Yeah, I wish you would. I also want to say you're a little bit. I want to make sure people understand that by being the leading Fortune journalist, sort of interviewing tech titans and CEOs and other interesting people over the course of many years, you really have an inside view of that scene and of those people, and one that's really sort of pretty extraordinary. And also you're among the few people I know who's also, if I may sort of out you, as a poet and a creative person and a Quaker. And so and a kind of a, I don't know if you'd call it lefty, but I would call anyway, a progressive person. And so
doesn't offend me.
Okay, but so but you've been in that world.
I don't think I'm really a lefty, but
okay, well, right, not that. So anyway, whatever. You're okay. But
too grounded in economics to be truly a lefty or something. But maybe, but if
yeah, okay,
I don't know.
All right.
Maybe,
what was about the left, right?
No.
I'm sorry. I shouldn't have gone there. But in any case, I think that what I find interesting, right, and in talking with you, and I hope this will come out in the thing you're going to say, is that you actually do know the people in this scene and kind of know how they look at things, and that's very helpful. So.
Go. Oh yeah, I want to read John Markoff's new book about Stuart Brand.
Oh yeah,
it's going to be very important.
Yeah.
It's not quite out yet. It's coming out like in a few weeks, I think.
I know. Everybody's pre-ordering now.
Well, it's true that when I was at Fortune, I had the privilege of getting to know all the leaders of tech, and for better or for worse. But what you and I talked about, Jim, that this audience might find interesting, and then you can maybe do the job of trying to tie it to the theme of ecosystems, is that I feel that my own work has always been deeply connected to the idea of the empowerment of the individual. And that in my work at Fortune, I mean, back in like, I don't know, probably the late 80s, I think it was, I wrote a cover story, not a cover story, a story about how the employees had taken ownership of Avis in an ESOP and how that changed. It was a very brief shining moment in the history of employee ownership. It didn't last too long. But I also got very interested in groupware because of its ability to give voice to individual expression inside an organization. And I probably wrote more about groupware. Probably many people on this meeting don't even know what it was, but that was a series of different kinds of software products in the 90s that were designed to enable more effective functioning of a group. And they happen both at the macro level, most notably with Lotus Notes in an organizational context, but also one of the things that I found quite interesting and had studied a lot was these so-called electronic meeting rooms at the time, where it was a conference room where each seat had a laptop right in the front of the participant, and it was delivered. The software in those meeting rooms was designed to enable lateral communication in the midst of the meeting. It's exactly what we all do every day, all the time now, where we're texting our friends, colleagues, and spouses and everything right now while we're doing this, as well as chatting in the Zoom and all this stuff, and probably having iChat meetings and maybe a little slacking on the side. And, you know, this is the world we are now fully immersed in, but at the time it was breakthrough. The idea that people could do multiple things at once and were encouraged to do that. And the thing that's so interesting about the electronic meeting rooms in my journalistic career was that there was some pretty good research done at the time on innovation and the use of those systems, which really found that they did increase the pace and effectiveness of innovation. And what really got my attention was that nonetheless, those systems all failed, and they were excluded and removed from every major company where they operated. You know, Dell was a company, had it, Boeing had it. You know, there were a number of companies really dove into this, and they all pulled it out later. And the reason was because they threatened the managerial prerogative, and that managers didn't like employees getting a voice, in effect. And so the reason that's significant in my kind of journalistic journey is that I had that history in my head when Facebook came along, and it was in 2006 when I first met Mark Zuckerberg. Facebook had 9 million users and was just beginning to tiptoe out of the student-only design that it had started with. And when I met Zuckerberg and he told me about how it worked and I spent a little time with it, I realized that Facebook, and this was absolutely breakthrough at the time and a new thing to me, was a system that was essentially groupware that could not be prevented from pervading any organization or society. That it was an empowerment of the individual by definition. It was an individually oriented communications tool that gave people the agency to organize or express their views without the superimposition of any control. And I thought, oh, that's probably something that's going to succeed. And clearly it did. So I wrote a book about it, which was maybe a little early. It came out in 2010, but it was a pretty, positive. But to me, it's significant that, and then of course, all the things that have followed on Facebook, including Zoom and Slack and all these things we all use day in and day out, really were designed based on the same premise. And that's a good thing. And I think so despite the fact that I would say that still, and Jim would say that, I think you just said it, that businesses are still most of the time operated on the premise of a very control-oriented mindset. We now have the potential to do something different. And then of course, there's the question of what's the impact of that at the macro and micro level. And in Facebook's case, it's turned out to have as many negative consequences, or almost as many negative consequences as positive ones on a societal level. But they're all about empowerment and how that empowerment is used or abused or shanghaied, so to speak. So anyway, is that relevant, Jim?
Yeah, it is. And I think that so when you and I were talking informally the other night about this, you mentioned the person that you got to know at Boeing, who was involved in group activities there. Right. And you got to know this guy. And then a year later, he gets a hold of you and says, you might like to know what happened. Right. And then he tells you the story about how basically it was threatening and it got kind of ripped out. And that to me is emblematic of a kind of struggle that I think is kind of going on, including at Facebook, by the way. So if I look at Facebook, yeah, there's a lot of room for, how can I say? There's a lot of people being empowered individually to connect with other people in sort of any way they want. And the architecture of the web itself is that way, right? The resources are all out there and any individual can sort of reach in and go anywhere they want. So that's there, but there's also the business model itself is advertisers, paying to, the good side is to get messages to people who might really need their product. And the bad side is to manipulate people to, spend more and more time on Facebook and to buy more and more products that they don't necessarily really need and for reasons that won't make them happy. And so I do think there is this giant struggle going on in the technosphere, if you will, kind of in the, we can call it the metaverse if you want, but the real metaverse. The socio-technical system we have of the sort of the web, et cetera, and media. There's a real struggle, I think, going on between individual empowerment values and people being able to pull together to make change, and then other people who have a tremendous interest in not having that happen.
Right.
And
I mean, from standpoint of ecosystems, my thinking is that, if individuals deserve to have agency and power, in effect, the effective ecosystems of any sort must respect and facilitate and reinforce and capitalize upon and allow that energy to build collectively. And yet my sad observation from closely watching Facebook over the last 15 years is that because governance was so inadequate, the outcome of the potentiality was radically undermined. And I sadly kind of feel, I think, based on that observation and other things that I've seen, that it's very, very rare for ecosystems that are based upon attempt to consolidate the energies of multiple empowered individuals to be effectively enough governed that they can actually begin to have the potential, the positive potential that we might, theoretically believe them to have. And that I find somewhat dispiriting, even though I am still an optimist about the long-term opportunity. But that is it's hard to find too many examples where the governance has been effective enough that individual empowered people have been able to collectively contribute at scale. I mean, it happens at a more micro level quite often.
Yeah.
But the thing about Facebook that was so interesting was it was destined to be a system of billions. It today is a system of billions, 3 billion roughly, of participants in that ecosystem. But it is a system that is absolutely and unilaterally controlled by one individual whose values turn out to be not very good.
Yeah, and then as you said before, and then he has an apparent willingness to not only consolidate his power, but find other people he's willing to help consolidate their power by using his platform. Particularly the so-called populist, ironically named politicians. And so, yeah, I think that I think that position he has, or that position of being an owner of one of these things, is just enormously powerful. I do, however, think that there are people who are oriented differently, and I think that they do reap enormous benefits from it, and it may be that they will ultimately outcompete the Facebooks. And so, two examples that I have. One is Hire Group. I mean, it is a worldwide company. It's it is, depending on how you count, but certainly by units of large appliance sales, it's the largest in the world. It owns GE and Candy Apple and Fisher and Paykel, and and yet it is, and I must say, having gotten closer and closer, astoundingly, oriented toward empowering individuals and small groups of individuals and empowering them sort of to build up and work together to make good stuff and to make good lives for people. I think the other one that I spent a lot of time on was the ARM ecosystem, which builds smartphones. And it's under a lot of geopolitical stress now, but with the sort of companies trying to sort of cut telecom and chips apart. But that was an extraordinary ecosystem with extraordinary governance being exerted by the people at ARM. And I remember talking with Warren East about this. He was the CEO at ARM for the 10 years that they grew into what they are modern day. And he was still CEO when I spoke with him. And it was so fascinating what he thought about, right? Because his image of that ecosystem was a kind of a big matrix where various players, were trying to make innovation happen and then kind of combine in various interesting ways to make lots of different value networks, if you want to call them that. And the thing he was most concerned about was this excessive use of power by other big players in that system. And so he was constantly making little adjustments to kind of discipline that. He was almost like I don't know if he'd be comfortable saying this, but he was almost like his own antitrust enforcer. So a tangible example is that Qualcomm, which controlled a lot of the chip radio technology, was able before other companies to integrate the radio technology onto the regular microprocessor chip. And it became possible at a certain node, at a certain level of sort of Moore's law advancement, where you could run fast enough to do radios on a regular chip. So they were putting those together, and everybody else had to buy a chip from them and maybe a processor for them or from somebody else and put them together. And it was a big disadvantage. And one of those players came to West and East, I'm sorry, Warren East, and helped him sort of see what was going on. And then sort of the next version of the ARM architecture came out with a way to integrate things on one chip to level the playing field here. And there was a sort of constant effort at governance to keep the thing open and to keep the thing with sort of competing power centers. So I think it's doable, but it takes a different value system. I mean, the value system of ARM was not the value system of, say, Intel.
I don't know whether this is relevant, but I was just thinking about Microsoft, and Microsoft's values and corporate purpose from its outset, for year two or whatever, that motivated it and was their motto forever was a computer on every desk and in every home, right? And they didn't attempt to build an ecosystem, but they attempted to build essentially a community of empowerment, right? And that was astonishingly successful. I mean, somebody said in the chat, and when I was talking about groupware, et cetera, the internet evolved to be a collaborative tool with video and all this stuff. Well, the internet would not have emerged if Microsoft hadn't been able to deploy Windows at scale, because the internet and Netscape Navigator, et cetera, were apps on Windows. So somebody had to build a system that was easy for individuals to use. And then someone had to say, hey, we could connect them all using a graphical user interface to each other. And that's sort of what the World Wide Web was, and then, browser was the easy way to navigate the World Wide Web. And that rest is history, et cetera, et cetera. But interestingly, Microsoft has always failed when it's pretty much tried, not always, I mean, because I'm going to use a contrary example where they have succeeded, but generally Microsoft has failed when it's tried to manage ecosystems, but they have consistently created the potentiality for ecosystems to emerge. And I would say Apple is in the same way. And so I'm not totally cynical about leaders' motivations and consequence. Steve Jobs too, who was basically personally an asshole, was a true believer in the potentiality of the individual and the virtue of giving individuals an extraordinary tool of human enlargement and fulfillment, and he did it brilliantly in a world-changing way. But the other example that I was thinking about, just to throw in, is LinkedIn, which is now owned by Microsoft. So kudos to them for that. But LinkedIn effectively embodies the values of Reid Hoffman, who is, speaking of lefties, he really is a lefty, and he's one of those really enlightened business leaders from the standpoint of what he understood about, sort of political economy, so to speak. And then he turned it over to Jeff Weiner, who is another extremely enlightened business leader who really does think in terms of Ubuntu and things like that on a day-to-day basis in his personal life and in his business life. And so the architecture and feature function of LinkedIn really is the consequence of the leadership of enlightened individuals. And now, of course, Satya Nadella, who's an extremely enlightened leader as business leaders go, one of possibly the most enlightened big business leader in the world, has taken Microsoft and, shifted it to be more in line with all those values, which I think is spectacular. But I think, I don't know what I don't have any more, but that was all stuff I thought was relevant.
Well, I think, yeah, I think it is really relevant that, it kind of goes back to, here's what I feel we're trying to sharpen here is we live in this sort of ecosystem world, and we live in this world where people have big ones and little ones, and people can start them, and there's this kind of new world of this empowered ability of people individually and ability to come together and so forth. And in that world, there's conflicts of values, right? There's a sort of a big fundamental concept which has to do with, do you think the potential of people is kind of infinite and open and diverse and should be celebrated? And that's really where what I thought it was great that Martin Reeves made this distinction between kind of real value, fundamental value that changes things for the better, and kind of economic value, and financial value. So the real value comes from creative people doing creative things, right? So there's that set of values, and then there's another set of values over here which say, "Ooh, good," So if all those people create a bunch of value, I bet I could bid a lot of it by lacing it all together and taking my piece. And I think that is a challenge going on. And but I want to pop us up. I'm looking at the clock, we've got 10 minutes or so. And I would love to try to pop us up. And also if people on the chat line want to weigh in. How do we go up the scale now to affect the world, more broadly?
Right. Can I just jump into that? Yeah. Because look, where are we? We are at a time, as we've said before, the climate is genuinely threatening all of our personal and societal existence. It is existentially threatening, right? We are, whether, especially if you look at it at a time scale of 50 plus years, if we don't act, we are really, really screwed, right? When has an ecosystem mindset ever been more absolutely indispensable than today? Unfortunately, for that ecosystem to function properly, it has to include more or less all the governments of the world, all the big corporate players of the world, all the, everybody. It's got to include, the more, it can probably function without everybody, but the more participatory ecosystem mindset that we can adopt at the global scale, the more likely we are to make the wrenching shifts that must be made.
So therefore, what do we do? I mean, I think that's and I don't mean to sound so helpless, but I think that's fundamentally correct. And I guess if I just come back to where I live a lot, I'm sorry, go ahead. You seem to have an answer.
No, I mean, I think, I hate to say it, and it's sad that it's at the price of the Ukrainian people, but Putin is giving the object lesson to the world about it right now. I mean, and it's not exactly in the domain of climate, but it pertains to the domain of climate directly and so obviously, because he is a fossil fuel empowered dictator who is, just whatever. We know what he's doing. It's horrific. But it is, look at the astonishing coming together that's occurring globally in response. And, you know, it's not just in the political and diplomatic realms,
Yeah.
which it definitely is. There's an amazing thread I saw on Twitter yesterday that was enumerating all of the ways that various European countries, and I could maybe find it and put it in the chat before we finish, if we, in a second, all the ways different European countries are radically upping their commitment to renewable energy in real time in the last few weeks. You know, or, you know, Belgium decided to delay the decommissioning of nuclear reactors, or, you know, they've dramatically changed the finance. They were going to eliminate tax deductions for solar in Germany, and in the last 2 weeks they decided, no, we're going to keep allowing you to deduct. And there's this new radical increase in wind commitment for a variety of countries across Northern Europe. I mean, it's really great. It takes crisis sometimes to motivate, but that's how I'm going to find that Twitter thread right now and put it in there while you say something. Then hold on.
Well, I'm looking at that. I want to look over here at what's happening on the chat, and you know, Johan Wong is talking about, you know, well, how do we scale these things up? How do we? I like this. How do we go beyond serendipity and have more intentionality? Like, serendipity is great, but how do we really make things move? I mean, I think that let me just say that I think that what is happening, to David's point, is that leaders who do command, you know, powerful positions are changing their perspective, and so that helps. I think also that groups of people and individuals are changing their perspective, and that helps. And what I don't exactly know how to do is get, how can I say? Somebody pointed out in the chat, how do we get selection for these sort of positive things faster? You know, like how do we get innovations to be selected for and move forward faster? And I think, you know, in a way, we could focus on the selective mechanism of, you know, people's buying and, you know, in this case, the national conflicts. Go ahead. You find the. But I think, let me just say,
I was just going to mention one name.
We're trying to open up a, yeah. Oh,
Greta
yeah.
Thunberg. I mean, you know, we are very fortunate that some young people have been able to focus sufficiently on the scale of the crisis to help us morally focus ourselves. That's worth mentioning. And it's really, that's a global movement of young, inspired activists who demand that we act as a global ecosystem.
Yeah.
But I still would so go back to my earlier problematic point, which is the governance and leadership of ecosystems. I mean, in the case of LinkedIn, you know, you have more or less a benign dictator CEO, and maybe even Microsoft today, and you know, that's what it seems to take, you know. But is there any way, you know, I one of the things I look at is, you know, there's this very big fad of distributed autonomous organizations, and the idea that, you know, oh, collectively we're going to make things happen. Well, I'm not very optimistic about the prospects for those, given what we've seen in such distributed organizations up to now in the modern era. But we've got to figure out a way for governance to be overseen in a benign manner in any kind. I mean, otherwise essentially the evil, powerful forces take control for their own profit or power.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I guess my own contribution to that has been that what I do think is important is that we expose the that people are aware that leaders do have power that sometimes they don't understand they have, to play in spaces that people don't understand actually matter and exist. And I was invited years ago to talk to the American Antitrust Association about this, to the sort of antitrust lawyers and regulators. And, you know, my comment was, you don't have a clue. I mean, I said it more nicely, but I said, you know, what you don't understand is that you have, you know, CEOs and executives and boards out there playing games with industry structure as you think about it, way out in sophistication advanced what you even think they're doing. And also inherently it will be secret because people keep their strategies secret, particularly these kind of strategies. And so, you know, we have to have the regulators catch up, and we have to have public knowledge and journalists, you know, be on top of it. I mean, there, in a certain sense, the power, I guess, is public conversation still about these things to some extent, but I don't know. I mean, our goal, by the way, and I say this because we've got a couple more minutes, and I don't want the last word. But what I want to say is we feel a little awkward not having some big rousing close, but there isn't a rousing close from my standpoint. What I think we hoped to do today, and I hope you all found it at least somewhat useful, is to open up a space of conversation around these kind of topics. And I don't know how we keep engaged with you, but I did stick my email address on there. You know, I don't know, I'm happy to try to figure out how to be helpful to people on this. And, you know, I think David is too.
Well, my work is predominantly organizing collective conversations in conferences, both online and now in person again. And next Tuesday, we have the Techonomy Climate Conference, which I just put the link to in the chat. And I would just have to say that's what I'm working on. And I found that through several decades of organizing conferences that it really matters what happens when people come together in physical form. And I'm all for collective virtual and even metaversal conversation, but I'm still really awed by what happens when people come together in person in conferences and other collective in-person bodies.
Yeah.
Both are good.
And that one, by the way, is for the virtual one's free, right?
Yeah, you can go to Techonomy Climate for free virtually, and it's practically free to come in person, although we're pretty much running out of space. It's in Mountain View, California on Tuesday. Just for what it's worth. I have to throw in a plug for that since I did brand things.
Well, if people like your values, they know where to find you. All right, I guess I want to thank the audience. I'm looking back across this. Pia Lauritsen, who was sort of inspired me to try to do this, any fourth wall breaking I managed to get to do here today, says, we have to go slow, make room for reflection, and patiently listen to each other's experience and perspectives. In order to go fast, identify and act on our shared interests. I think that's great. I think that's great. Yeah. I'm reminded of, well, anyway, I'm not have to be reminded of anything. That's great. So maybe.
Well, thank you for inviting me to join you at this, Jim. I was honored, and I'm glad to be your acolyte.
Well, okay, thank you very much. I mean, but you know, whatever. You know, I'll see you at your conference hopefully next week. But anyway, thanks very much, everybody in the audience. I really appreciate this, and you know, I just hope to be seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.